Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's book talk with author and historian David Freeland, author of tonight's book talk, American Hotel, the Waldorf-Astoria and the Making of a Century. We are very excited to have him speaking about his book tonight. If anyone was unaware, the Waldorf got interior landmarks several years ago, and HGC was a huge component in that. We did a walking tour where we had hundreds of people come into Waldorf-Astoria, so much so that I got called into the security office because we basically got in trouble for flooding the entire place. So I got called to the principal's office, but it worked. And we do have still a walking tour guide on our website. But this book, I'm sure, will be much, much nicer with much better pictures. And so the presentation should be great. And with that, I'll hand it over to David.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you for having me, and to my friends at HDC for having me, and to all of your great work on behalf of this wonderful building. So my book actually covers both Waldorf-Astorias, the original one down on 34th Street and 5th Avenue, and the current one that we know today on 50th and Park. So I'm going to start the lecture speaking a bit about the first Waldorf, and then we'll move into the current one. So the Waldorf-Astoria is often, the history of the Waldorf, the origin of the Waldorf is often discussed in terms of a rivalry between two feuding cousins, William Waldorf-Astor here on the left, and John Jacob Astor the fourth on the right. William Waldorf-Astor grew up in his family mansion on 33rd Street and 5th Avenue, in what was then a very quiet, elegant residential neighborhood. When his father, John Jacob Astor, died in 1890, William Waldorf, Willie as he was known, had plans to develop the property of the family house. And that's what he did. And the whole process began around 1891 and lasted for a couple of years, and it caused a tremendous noise. And no doubt his neighbor, who was his aunt, known as the Mrs. Astor, Caroline Astor, no doubt she was quite annoyed during the whole construction process. And the story goes that her son, who lived in her house, John Jacob Astor IV, the story goes that once the Hotel Waldorf opened in 1893, John Jacob Astor, in sort of a case of one-upmanship, decided to build a hotel on his family's property at the other end of the block. So there's a lot of exaggeration in this story. Probably the real story is that the two cousins, while they were never exactly close, their relationship was more one of like a coolness, I would say. In fact, one observer saw them enter the same cafe one day for lunch and noticed that William Waldorf Astor went inside and had his lunch in one corner of the cafe, and John Jacob went inside and had his lunch in a whole different corner, and neither one seemed to be aware of the other's presence. So that, I think, kind of summarizes the tone of their relationship. So you can see here, this is the completed Hotel Waldorf. It opened in March of 1893. And you can see on the right here, there's a little glimpse of Mrs. Astor's yard. And then this is Caroline Astor's house, this wall right here. So this is the house where John Jacob grew up, and the Hotel Waldorf occupied the property where William Waldorf grew up. Basically, William Waldorf I wouldn't say he necessarily had a huge emotional attachment to the hotel as a hotel. In fact, as far as we're aware, he only actually visited the hotel one time. He was in England most of the time. Really, I would say that the Hotel Waldorf was a way to make the most of the family's finances. But early on, it developed a reputation for being a haven of the elite and the well-to-do. And as a matter of fact, the very first entrance to the hotel is right here on 33rd Street, even though Fifth Avenue at the time was pretty sedate still and residential, as I said. It was felt that it would be better to have an entrance off to the side, a little bit out of the light of Fifth Avenue. So that's why you see the entrance here with the canopies on the left. So the Waldorf was known from the very beginning for its architecture, and this building was designed by Henry Hardenberg. We know him today in large part due to the Dakota on Central Park West, also the Hotel Plaza. And he designed it, he modeled it after Heidelberg Castle in Germany. A lot of whimsical turrets and things like that. But if you entered from the side here and you walked all the way back, one of the first things you would see was the Palm Garden. And this was one of New York's most luxurious restaurants and dining places in the last years of the 19th century, the first years of the 20th. And as you can see, hopefully a little bit from this photograph, the setting was quite lovely and magical. There was a dome of tessellated glass above and multicolored glass, so that during the day, when patrons were having lunch, the light would stream down and suffuse the space and fill it with color. And of course, there were a lot of plants, and it was just such a verdant atmosphere, very refined and elegant. And for the first few years of the Waldorf's existence, before the Astoria was built, there would have been a lot more light. So from the very beginning, pretty much, the Hotel Waldorf was known for music and entertainment. And it was known for other things too, but especially music. And one of the first series of programs that occurred at the Waldorf were these programs called musical mornings. And the fellow who introduced these was a man named Albert Morris Bagby. And he was a real bon vivant and somebody who knew personally a lot of performers and stars of the Metropolitan Opera. And he was able to convince them somehow, actually with really good fees, he was able to convince them to get up very early on a Monday morning and be ready to perform at like 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock. Nellie Melba, when he first proposed the idea to her, she said, well, I can't even spit at 11 o'clock in the morning. But as I said, the performers were paid very well, and these became big society events. As a matter of fact, Enrico Caruso performed as part of these over 24 times, I believe. And these were so popular that they actually continued on into the new Waldorf into the early 1940s with the same man, Bagby, as conductor. So this is a photograph that I have in the book, and I want to share it with you here because one of the themes of my book is the way that the Waldorf as a social institution interacted with the city that surrounded it. It might have been set up at the very beginning as a kind of elite preserve, but of course it was part of a city that was growing, that was changing, that was becoming more diverse, more multicultural with immigration and so on. So that kind of pushing and pulling between the Waldorf and the city kind of does push some of my narrative along as you read the book. And here we have a scene from the late 1890s. And it's probably a Sunday afternoon. You see people taking a stroll, a promenade along Fifth Avenue. And just a very relaxed afternoon. You see some flower sellers here on the left and on the right. It was a thing, for a gentleman strolling with a woman, perhaps to buy her flowers. And it's just such a lovely scene. And the Waldorf, of course, is here on the left. But one of the things that I find very striking about this image, and something I did not notice until I secured the rights to reproduce it and blew it up myself, is that if you look in the very center, there's an extremely well-dressed African-American gentleman walking also. So we can see that, the already, in spite of the Waldorf's kind of elite reputation, it was part of a diverse city, and this is a theme that I would say becomes stronger in the decades to come. So the Waldorf, the Astoria portion of the hotel opened in 1897. So 4 years, about 3.5 years after the Hotel Waldorf had opened. And just to give you a sense of the size of this structure, which Henry Hardenberg also designed, everything here on the right is the Astoria portion of the hotel, and the Waldorf, the original Waldorf, is really just this part here on the left, pretty small section. The size more than doubled. And from the very beginning, the hotels were operated jointly as the Waldorf-Astoria, as a popular song of the day put it, meet me at the hyphen. So there are a lot of stories and myths about the Waldorf-Astoria that you might hear. One has to do with Peacock Alley. Many of you probably have heard of Peacock Alley. It's just a great show place, a place where people came to see and be seen, and would strut like peacocks. It's often described as being a connecting hallway between the two hotels. Actually, that's not true. As you can see here, the Waldorf is this upper rectangle here on the left, and it really fit pretty snugly within the Astoria that surrounded it here. So there really was no connecting hallway, so to speak. Generally, it was agreed that Peacock Alley referred to this long corridor here running along the 34th Street side of the building. So here's a great scene from about 1900 of Peacock Alley at its peak, so to speak. And we see people socializing and talking, whispering to one another, lots of quiet confidences and conspiratorial looks and so forth. So you really do see here how this was a place where people showed off. The term Peacock Alley was a facetious one that was bestowed by newspaper reporters. The Waldorf itself would never at that time have promoted a name like Peacock Alley, because the connection with alleys was not something that they would have wanted to emphasize. In the late 19th century, alleys were considered very lowly places, and not something that you would want to associate with the Waldorf-Astoria. So Peacock Alley was something facetious. It wasn't really until the 1920s, I believe, that as far as I can tell, that the hotel began to use it for its publicity, kind of as a nostalgic term. But one of the things that's very clever about this drawing is you can see here a bit of flirtation going on. On the left, you have a man kind of everyone's well dressed, but a man standing up here, and there's an elegant woman kind of pressed very close to him. And then there's another gentleman here walking, and as he passes, she turns around to him and greets him. So there's a little bit of a flirtation here going on. And obviously it's very subtle, but this little hint of indecorousness here speaks to something larger that was part of the world of the hotel at the time, and that was that the hotel sat on the fringe of the Tenderloin. The Tenderloin, as many of you may know, was the really famous vice district of late 19th century New York, and it was not a place like the Bowery. It was really a place of elegant vice, expensive vice. The Tenderloin really grew up kind of in the back to the west of all of these elegant hotels of Fifth Avenue and Broadway. So from the beginning, the managers of the Waldorf-Astoria were very concerned about all of these pernicious elements that were really outside the periphery of the hotel, always threatening to come in. And it set up a pretty a tricky contradiction in a way, because hotels, even though they're privately owned, they operate as public spaces. And the Waldorf, for the most part, always allowed people to kind of come in and wander, sit on benches and so forth. They didn't always necessarily have to be guests. So that meant that all of these tenderloin characters were always a threat. So the hotel employed, like all hotels at the time, employed house detectives, plainclothes detectives, who were extremely vigilant in rooting out all forms of immorality, gambling, confidence men, and so forth, but also adulterous couples, anyone who tried to rent a room and was not married. So this became a really big thing and a big effort. And you can see here, this is kind of like the bawdy, risque version of the same scene. This just shows you a scene from the Tenderloin, a Tenderloin establishment. I believe this is the court room of Coster and Biles. And as you can see, we have men and women cavorting quite loosely, drinking champagne, and it's a rather amusing scene. Something that is one of the great stories of the Waldorf, the original Waldorf, is something called the Secret Black Book. This was a detective's log that all of the house detectives I was mentioning a moment ago kept. And the logs, of which only 2 survive, detailed all sorts of criminal activity happening on the premises. A lot of it's not that interesting. Some of it has to do with, stolen coats and jewelry and so forth. But there's a lot of stuff in these 2 logbooks about the extent to which the hotel detectives would go to root out adulterous couples and couples who were not married, sharing a room together, and in some cases having actual sex, which is what happened here. And I'll blow it up for you in a moment, but it's the very top entry right here. Funny side note about these books, these are not supposed to exist. There's one from 1902 and another from 1904. Thankfully, when the Waldorf-Astoria, the original Waldorf-Astoria, decided to donate a lot of its records to the New York Public Library in 1929, well, it never intended for these to be part of it. But fortunately, somebody was going through the dumpster during demolition and found this object and brought it to the library and said, here, I think you might like to have this. And the curators at the library were so excited to have it, because there had always been such conjecture over the years by newspaper reporters and so on about what these secret black books might contain, because only a few senior Waldorf staff members ever saw these, and no one else could. So the library held on to these for years without telling the Waldorf it actually had them. Now, thankfully, both of them can be perused. This is a blow up of what I showed you before. The entry is signed by Joe Smith, who was the head house detective, and it happened on a Sunday, October 12th, 1902, put up Dr. Woodward from room 864, occupied by a Mrs. Loomis, the former occupying room 1468. When I entered with Mr. Barse was a manager, they were both undressed and had used the bed. Doesn't say how he observed that, but had them pay their bill and get out. So obviously this was a very embarrassing situation for this couple. You might think that these were, I don't know, maybe lower middle class people who had come to the hotel looking for some time to spend together. They were not. These were actually members of the upper crust of New York society. Both Dr. Woodward and Mrs. Loomis were on the social register. They were exactly the kind of guests that the Waldorf would most want to have. Dr. Woodward was a noted eye surgeon, and he wrote a book on treating cataracts. He was descended from one of the surgeons at the War of 1812. Mrs. Loomis, her father had been an ambassador to Great Britain. If you go to Vermont, to Burlington, Vermont, there's a Loomis Street today named after the family, and also one in Chicago. So these were extreme, very, very prominent people, but it didn't matter. They were kicked out anyway, because that's the extent that the Waldorf went to ensure that it would be reputable. It didn't want to be thought of as a place of easy assignation. So I get more into this into the book. It's a lot to unpack here. But if you're curious, I do discuss this a lot more in the book, in the early chapters. And I also want to share that there's a flip side to all of this obsessiveness, which is that the Waldorf security team was so good and so adept at rooting out this kind of behavior, that in many ways it allowed the Waldorf to be progressive in other areas. And it is something of a contradiction, but the Waldorf, for example, was one of the first hotels, probably the first in New York, to allow women who happened to be unescorted, that means without a male companion, to enter its restaurants after a certain hour, like 7 or 8 o'clock, and dine by themselves. For many, many decades, women had not been permitted into dining establishments in New York, into the top dining establishments, if they were alone after a certain hour, because it was assumed that reputable women didn't dine by themselves at night. So the Waldorf was the one to break that pattern. And one of the patterns that we do see within the history of the Waldorf is that because of the Waldorf stature within the hotel community, when the Waldorf did something, when it set a policy like this, that was kind of like a signal for other hotels to do the same thing. And we see this again and again. The Waldorf was truly a leader. So the original Waldorf-Astoria didn't last so very long. By the end of 1928, plans were announced that it would be demolished. Basically, by this point, the Tenderloin, the Vice District, had disappeared pretty much. That began really with the construction of Penn Station, which started about 1903, 1904, finished in 1910. That effaced a large section of the Tenderloin's northern part. And I think probably many the proprietors of the Waldorf thought that this was good news at first, because prostitution wouldn't be right outside its door so brazenly. But it really wasn't a good thing, because along with the Tenderloin went the theater district. And at the time, when the Waldorf was around the turn of the century, there were so many theaters right around it. And it was right in the center of that theatrical and entertainment life. And people would patronize its bars and restaurants for that reason. Starting really around the teens, entertainment life moved north to Times Square. And by the 20s, the Waldorf was really kind of out of it. It was way away from the action, and people didn't go down there so much anymore. So between that and the effects of prohibition, where couldn't serve alcohol, the Waldorf was really doomed by the 1920s. And here's a shot that I find kind of amusing. The demolition workers here are making fun, gentle fun, of the building's reputation, the building that they've been hired to destroy. You can see them; they're donning top hats and wearing monocles, and they're using they've got some canes, and it's just kind of a little fun that they were having. And you can see even here the quality of the way the building had been constructed. One historian wrote that the Waldorf did not go gladly. It took a lot of hammering and slamming to destroy it, because it had been built to last a lot longer than it did. So here, all the tiles had been stripped, but we can still see some ornamentation on this pillar over to the right. And I think probably most of you know what replaced the original Waldorf-Astoria: the Empire State Building. So the idea, though, for a new Waldorf-Astoria actually had been in the works for some time. The trick had been to find a location. By the 1920s, there was such building in Manhattan that it was really difficult to find big parcels of land. But fortunately, New York Central Railroad had such a parcel. It had this gigantic train yard that extended northward from Grand Central Station. And after the turn of the century, when the steam trains that formerly had been above ground and caused a lot of accidents and were pretty horrific, after those were sunk, all of a sudden, New York Central Railroad found itself with a lot of land that it could lease. It would still hold the rights to the land itself, but at least the properties. So there were quite a few structures built between 43rd on up to 50th. This was the northernmost parcel, and the last one that was kind of available. It didn't mean it was unoccupied. There was already a YMCA, few buildings that had been built in the teens on the site, and most challengingly, there was this power plant that had to be dismantled. It was quite an undertaking. There were a lot of complex phases to this project, which had to be completed on a very tight schedule. This is 1930, and one of the most challenging portions of this had to do with the dismantling of 8 gigantic 10-foot rotary converters. Each one was a massive wheel on a supporting base. Each one had to be dismantled. Just to give you an idea, even the piston that connected the wheel with the base weighed 3 tons. Each one had to be taken out, lowered by pulley down to the tracks below. We can see the tracks here. And then hauled 7 blocks south to the basement of a new structure. All of this had to happen while the trains below were still running. So reading the accounts today, it's kind of shocking that that they were able to get away with so much. But if there had been any accident, if by chance one of these gigantic wheels had fallen, they could have crushed the trains and passengers. So you can see also that the Waldorf really does not have a basement per se. It was actually built on massive steel columns that bestrode the tracks. So the tracks just stayed under, and trains were able to keep running all the while. So it is really quite a remarkable building, both inside and out. So initially, the plans for the Waldorf, the initial plans were calling for something more of a neo-Gothic style, which typified the late 1920s. The architect firm was Schultz and Weaver. They had designed a lot of hotels. Let's see, they're known for, well, if anyone knows the Freedom Tower in Miami, they designed that. They also designed the Sherry Netherland in New York on Central Park South. And this design actually bears a bit in common with the Sherry Netherland. You can see here, if you look carefully, some neo-Gothic finials, those kinds of design elements that look more to the past. The man who really directed the Waldorf's move from its old location to its new one, he'd been the manager at the old location, and he became the president of the corporation that oversaw the construction of the new Waldorf was this fellow named Lucius Boomer. He had a very unusual background. He grew up in a religious cult in Florida, and I go into that quite a bit in the book because the philosophies that he was exposed to as part of this religious cult, whose leader believed he was the reincarnated Christ, actually influenced a lot of his writings later on and about the role of hotel keepers and what hotels meant to society. He was very interested in problems of living. The group that he had grown up in was a kind of a communistic body, very progressive in many ways when it came to race and women's rights and so on. But he eventually left the order. He didn't stay in the order, but the ideals that he had been exposed to stayed with him, I believe, through much of his life. And he really wanted something for the hotel that was what he called modern without being modernistic. In other words, he wanted something that was modern without being unnecessarily austere. So this was the result. You saw it a moment ago, flipped ahead accidentally, but this is, of course, the building that we all know. By this point, all of the neo-Gothic details have been discarded, and we see the style that we now know as Art Deco. Most prominently, and perhaps the most famous exterior element of the building, are these the two peaks here, the Art Deco peaks. Incidentally, this was the very last hotel designed by the Schultz and Weaver firm. It was also the last large hotel with more than 1,000 rooms built in in Manhattan, I should say, for the next 30 years. There had been such feverish building in the 1920s. The 1920s were really the golden era of hotel building, and so many properties were built during that time, during that decade in New York, that when the Depression hit, all of a sudden, probably about 80% of them were going bankrupt, and there was just no more need for any further hotels. It really wasn't until that late, until the 1950s, that people started to realize, yeah, we need some new hotels, some big hotels. So the new Waldorf-Astoria was inaugurated on September 30th, 1931, so at 6:00 p.m. So really about this exact time today, 90 years ago. And President Herbert Hoover opened the hotel with an address. Now, this was given in Washington from the White House. It was not given on site, but it was a big deal. He gave quite a large speech, a long speech. And it might seem kind of strange today to have a sitting president deliver the opening ceremonies to a new hotel. But at the time, Hoover really wanted to assure Americans that the worst was behind them and that we were moving out of this. Kind of sounds familiar. So this fit really into his goal in that respect. And also at the time, hotels through much of the 20th century really occupied, I would say, a much more prominent place within the social life of the city and the country than they do today. I'll read you a little bit, just a little bit from his speech, which was broadcast via NBC radio, so people across the country would hear this. The opening of the new Waldorf-Astoria is an event in the advancement of hotels. It carries on a great tradition in national hospitality. So hospitality is a key concept. The erection of this great structure at this time has been a contribution to the maintenance of employment and is an exhibition of courage and confidence to the whole nation. So he really wanted to show that the Waldorf-Astoria was something this large could be built at this time, really pointed to the future and a better future. And then he said, our hotels have become community institutions. They are the center points of civic hospitality. They are the meeting place of 1,000 community and national activities. They have come to be conducted in far larger vision than mere profit earning. So he very much understood the significance of the hotel as an institution in American life. Hotels were meeting places, and hotel managers and owners like Lucius Boomer really saw themselves as social leaders having a kind of responsibility um, in the act of opening doors, showing hospitality to a diverse range of people. And that's why you see so much happening at the Waldorf Astoria, so many events, some of which I chronicle in the book. So as I mentioned, there's the social element, but there's also the music element of the Waldorf Astoria. That was always a part of its history. And in that it was a leader also. So if you look back to like 1938, 39, swing music was really at the time young people's music. So it was pretty surprising when the Waldorf Astoria booked Benny Goodman and his band. One of the first interviews I did for the book was a woman named Louise Tobin, who was Benny Goodman's lead singer in 1939, and she sang at this engagement at the Waldorf Astoria. She's well over 100 now, and she said no one thought that a swing band would do that well at the Waldorf, but it did. And people came, and there were multiple engagements, and there he is in the center with the clarinet. But something else that was very striking about his band is that it was racially integrated. Here on left, we can see the great vibraphonist Lionel Hampton playing, for example. So this was significant on the Waldorf's part to book Benny Goodman, because I would say that probably hotels were the toughest barrier to break down for entertainers of color at the time, probably because a lot of hotel proprietors were afraid that if they had performers of color, it would lead to patronage that reflected that. So the Waldorf doing this was a pretty big step. And here again, we see where the Waldorf stature within the industry kind of then allowed other hotels to get on board. It was almost like they would look to the Waldorf and say, well, if the Waldorf's doing it, it must be okay, we can do it too. But the Waldorf took a much more active part than that even. Whenever you look at the history of the hotel industry, any committee, any type of lobbying group within the industry was usually Lucius Boomer or somebody at the Waldorf was at the head of that committee. So they were always working very actively in fulfillment of their role as hotel keepers. And then later on, in the 1950s, there still had not been a headliner of color to perform at a swanky New York hotel. And that changed when the Waldorf booked Dorothy Dandridge in 1955. And she had just had an Academy Award nomination for her work in Carmen Jones. So here again, when she headlined at the Empire Room, which was probably the Waldorf Astoria's most important performance space, competitors like the Plaza hired performers of color as well. The Plaza's version of the Empire Room was called the Maisonette, the Persian Room, excuse me, the Persian Room, and they had Eartha Kitt. So we can see how the Waldorf Astoria, through making these kinds of policy decisions, by that point it was owned by Conrad Hilton, influenced the industry at large. So throughout much of its early history on Park Avenue, the Waldorf Astoria did not make a lot of money, especially during the Depression. No hotel did, really. It just managed to stay afloat, and I cover that some in the book, how it did it. But what really was a pivotal moment in the history of the Waldorf Astoria, and what I would say elevated it to a new status as an institution, was the coming of the United Nations to New York in 1946. So when New York, quote unquote, got the UN, the spring, I think it was, of '46, New York really had to scramble because New York probably was not really prepared in terms of its infrastructure for the level of responsibility that was now being given to it as a new international capital. So the first UN assembly was taking place in the fall of 1946. And the UN Secretariat early on approached the Waldorf-Astoria, approached Lucius Boomer, and probably, the UN had the Waldorf's history as a host to diplomats and so on in mind, but it was also one of the closest large hotels to the temporary UN headquarters in Flushing Meadow, Queens. And the Secretariat had been particularly concerned about de facto segregation in the US and even in New York hotels, because at the time there was still a form of de facto segregation practiced. In many ways, the Waldorf had always been maybe a bit more tolerant. The ones that were probably more prejudiced were the ones that were maybe the next level down, like, say, the Algonquin, the ones that maybe had a bit more to lose, they felt in their minds. So the Secretariat approached Lucius Boomer and said, listen, we're very concerned about this. Will you agree to house all delegates, regardless of color? And if you do this, we'll always go to you for all of our events. And Boomer said yes. And so that's what happened. So from the very beginning, the Waldorf and the UN developed this extremely close relationship. And one of the things that happened by the end of that year was the Council of Foreign Ministers, which was actually held inside of the Waldorf-Astoria in Lucius Boomer's own apartment. This was a meeting of the four representatives of the four major Allied powers, the US, France, England, and the USSR. And this was like their fourth meeting. They had met in Paris, and they hadn't really been able to accomplish much. So it was decided that, well, since everyone's going to be here for the UN General Assembly, let's try to finish this all here. And that's what they did. So this just gives you an idea of the level of now international prominence and influence that the Waldorf-Astoria had. The future of Trieste was negotiated inside the Waldorf-Astoria in the towers. And this is just a letter that had been written by the then Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, to the manager, one of the managers, Frank Reddy at the Waldorf. Basically, to accommodate the foreign ministers and all their delegations, the Waldorf-Astoria had to bump a lot of guests and cancel. And so this was an explanatory, almost apologetic letter that the Waldorf had received from Dean Acheson and posted in the lobby so everyone could see it and understand. And the idea was, well, yes, we're very sorry that that your event or your accommodations are being bumped, but there's a greater good here, and you're sacrificing for a greater good. He wrote, in particular, the department realizes the inconvenience which will necessarily be caused to prospective guests and to the management. However, the work of the council is focused on the consideration of peace treaties with the former Axis powers and is unquestionably the most critical effort in which our world statesmen are today involved, and upon which the future peace and security of the world may well rest. So it was an appeal to the common good. And this was something that fit very much into the mission of Lucius Boomer and the Waldorf-Astoria and their colleagues within the industry. Much more than a place to sleep, definitely. So here's a photograph that I feel I love because it really emblematizes what the Waldorf-Astoria was for so much of its history. It's a scene from 1964. Evidently, someone has just said something kind of funny. But here we have a civil rights leader of international renown. Martin Luther King had just come back from receiving the Peace Prize from Europe, of course, Coretta Scott King. We have a sitting vice president, Humphrey, And then we have the New York City mayor, Wagner, here all together. This is what the Waldorf was, a coming together, a merging of the local, the national, and the international. Speaking of a stage for significant events, Richard Nixon, I don't know, you may not know this, but Richard Nixon actually accepted his presidency from the ballroom of the Waldorf-Astoria. All of those photographs you see of him holding the splayed fingers in the air were taken at the Waldorf. So that just gives you an idea of the kinds of events that took place here. It'd be very hard, I think, to imagine one of our hotels now having that kind of significance. But Nixon had been living in New York, and he basically just moved into the Waldorf for several days and came down at the appointed time. The funny side note to this, because many of these people kind of came from other areas, and they were Nixon supporters, so they were kind of, the joke was they weren't the hippest people, and one of the commentators looked at this scene and wrote, they were not very good at being ecstatic. Anyway, so speaking of presidents, now I'm going to take you more to the present day, and this is a tour that I took the very last week that the Waldorf was open, the end of February 2017, and quite unexpectedly, they took us up to the presidential suite. And this was where all the presidents stayed, really from Hoover through Obama. And one of the things that happened was everyone who stayed there, well, not everyone, but the tradition was to leave some piece of furniture or furnishing behind. So we have John F. Kennedy's rocking chair. Let's see, the clock I think came from Eisenhower. Even though he wasn't president, I think the desk is from MacArthur. So this was just a wonderful surprise to be able to tour this such a storied place. At the risk of looking a little silly, here's a photograph of my partner and me in the bathroom. The bathrooms were just glorious. These were in the Waldorf Towers. And I should say that my book really focuses much more on the Waldorf-Astoria as a hotel than the towers. The towers were adjacent to the Waldorf-Astoria, but they were from the beginning intended for long-term residency. And the towers really occupied a separate sphere. You could enter by a separate entrance. You did not have to go into the lobby of the Waldorf. You could if you wanted to, but you didn't have to. So my book really focuses much more on the Waldorf, I would say, as public space. But the bathrooms in the towers and in the presidential suite here were just glorious. And as you can see, I was quite, my partner and I were quite amazed by them. So for these last group of slides, I'm going to share some images, some of which I took and some were taken by others, but this is from the Waldorf during the final week it was open. And one of the great things about the Waldorf-Astoria was related to the space and the way a visitor could move through space. Many of you who have been there, will recall the experience of entering here on Park Avenue and walking through the rooms in kind of a straight line. And we have just some marvelous things on display here. There's beautiful murals up at the top. This is something called the Wheel of Life. This mosaic at the bottom was by a French artist, and it took about 8 years to do. And above, we have Cole Porter's piano. Cole Porter was a resident of the towers, and his piano, which had been off to the side, was moved to the center for the final night of the Waldorf existence. And this is a detail of the Wheel of Life. Each section of the mosaic represents a different stage in the life cycle. And the first tour guide who took me to this and showed it to me said, this is very much like a hotel, because we have from birth and then the peak of its maturity and then death, because the last figure in the wheel is a death figure, still powerful but slumped and kind of, resigned, falling into the arms of another. And a great thing about the Waldorf was just the experience of space. A very astute critic, Paul Goldberger, wrote of how the Waldorf was not where you went to escape the city, but I'm paraphrasing here, but to feel the pulse of the city throbbing through your veins. In many ways, the Waldorf was like an extension of the streets. As I said, you could walk in from Park Avenue and go all the way through from the Park Avenue lobby, which we just saw, through the main lobby, and then all the way to the other end, Lexington Avenue. And along the way, you would encounter so many marvelous things, like these beautiful pillars here with the flecked marble, the clock, which was from the original Waldorf-Astoria, and emits chimes every quarter hour, and they're just a beautiful, it's just a beautiful sound. This is now on display, I believe, at the New York Historical Society. It's going to return to the Waldorf-Astoria when it reopens in 2023. And we can just see how, as many of you know, if you took the tour, the self-guided tour, this is a place you could just come and look around and sit and just enjoy the comings and goings of metropolitan life. This is a detail of the ceiling, one of the many beautiful details. And everything in this set of slides, from the lobbies on through, has been fortunately preserved. As Michelle was saying earlier, the very last week the Waldorf-Astoria was open, thanks in large part to the lobbying efforts of HDC and its preservation colleagues. The Landmarks Commission came in at the very end and unanimously voted to designate much of the interior. So the exterior had already been designated in 1993, but as we all know, a facade can be preserved, but then if a building does not have interior designation also, anything can happen. So the new owners now will be preserving everything that we see in this photograph. The owner, about 1915, the Waldorf-Astoria was sold to a corporation called Anbang Investment Bank. And it was, at the time, it's a Chinese company. At the time, it was the largest hotel sale in US history. It was close to $2 billion. So there have been a lot of changes since then, but right now there's an initiative, a big initiative to sell condos in a big portion of the hotel, what had been the towers and the hotel. And when the building fully reopens in 2023, I think they're saying now, there probably will be about maybe 350 hotel rooms. But all of this wonderful detail, like the nickeled bronze elevator doors, which I think are some of perhaps the loveliest feature of the hotel, this will be preserved. This was designed by the same artist who did the mosaic, the floor mosaic. And if you've ever seen these doors in action, they're just lovely because these two willowy classical figures separate with the opening of the doors, and then they come together again with the closing. The Waldorf-Astoria really used such incredible materials throughout its construction. You see also a lot of burled walnut. You see it right here. And this is actually from the new Peacock Alley. When the Waldorf-Astoria opened in 1931, Peacock Alley became a corridor running side to side between the Park Avenue and the main lobbies. And by that point, the Waldorf-Astoria really publicized the name. The Waldorf was always very active when it came to publicity. It was one of the first hotels to hire a PR firm. And it always was very careful about the way it shaped its image and worked really hard to promote itself. Another preserved space is the Grand Ballroom, which is truly a remarkable space in the city. Of course, one of the attractions of the Waldorf-Astoria was its size and having a ballroom large enough to host really, really big events, which, believe it or not, a lot of hotels in Manhattan do not have. But building this was quite remarkable because above the ballroom, above this space that you see here, there's a gigantic truss, a gigantic steel truss, and it's about the length of a third of a city block. And that truss basically strides this ballroom, and it supports the weight of the entire hotel above. So all that weight above comes down on the truss, and then the weight is deflected to the sides of the ballroom here. And that's the triumph of the engineering. And one of my favorite spaces in the Waldorf-Astoria is the Silver Gallery. When Lucius Boomer, going back to his mandate to Schultz and Weaver, and specifically to the chief designer at Schultz and Weaver, they didn't do all the work themselves, but the mandate was to do something, to create something that looked to the future, but also honored the history of this institution. So if you approach this hallway, it looks like the most modern it would have looked like the most modern of the spaces in 1931. It's so sleek. It's paneled with mirrors, so everywhere you turn, you see your reflection in this multiplicity of glass panels, and it's just so striking, so elegant. It's like something from a Fred Astaire film from the 1930s. But if you look very closely, you'll see at the top a row of Impressionist paintings from the 1890s, or maybe earlier, that were brought from the original Waldorf-Astoria. So this row of paintings on both sides here of the arch came from the original Waldorf, and then were installed. So just note how clever Schultz and Weaver was to do this. They inserted within probably the most modern and sleek space of the new hotel. That's where they chose to insert a reminder of the history and the old days. And so there's this kind of dialogue between the first Waldorf and the new one. And it's just really striking to see, and all the more so when you realize the history and just how much Schultz and Weaver were thinking and working to honor this mandate of creating something that was both new and old at the same time. Here's the Empire Room today, the original Empire Room. It later moved across the hall, but if you recall that photograph of Dorothy Dandridge earlier, she was standing right about here, right against this riser. And this is just something that I took. This was a great New York entertainment space. So many great performers have headlined here, Peggy Lee, Lena Horne, Mel Torme, and as well as, Ike and Tina Turner and Cher, Diana Ross. So it was quite a performance space. Thankfully, this will be preserved as well. And again, the Waldorf was always pretty open about allowing people to walk around and take photographs. And that was really something special about it. Again, it was a public space in many ways. For much of its history, there were a lot of people who just came to the lobby, and they were known as chair warmers or lobby sitters, and they would just come to kind of pass the time. So here's a rendering of the lobby when it reopens. You've got Cole Porter's piano here, and of course the clock in the center, which came originally from the Chicago World's Fair. And here's a rendering of the restored building, the facade cleaned, and the peaks relit. So that the current date they're saying will be about 2023 when all this reopens. So I want to thank all of you for your attentiveness and for listening and for coming. So I think we have a few moments. I'm going to take a look at some of the questions that you've sent. Okay, I'm going to go to the Q&A.
Yes,
okay, so the question,
part one question.
Yes, okay, so the question is, David, you've previously written about the stomping grounds of immigrants and the working class, whereas this book centers on a famously upper class world. Could you comment on your experience researching and writing about these two worlds? Well, it's very interesting, as Dave Mulkins, thank you. I would say initially, when I began research on the book, I thought also that they were two very different worlds. Dave is referring to a book I did earlier some years ago titled Automat's Taxi Dances in Vaudeville, which really centers on recreational spaces that were predominantly working class in the city. So one of the things I realized, though, as I did research on the book, was that in many ways, the Waldorf-Astoria was never quite as elitist as its reputation would suggest. Partially, this was because of its size. You know, when the Astoria opened in 1897, now the hotel had something like 1,100 rooms. When the Waldorf-Astoria opened on Park Avenue, there have been a lot of different estimates of the number of rooms, but we believe it was over 2,000. So that's a lot of rooms to fill. And it's very hard, you know, to keep a hotel of that size exclusive, quote unquote, exclusive. You know, you have to allow a wider range of citizenry inside. What the Waldorf was really skillful at doing was taking those very early years, and really, I would say the hotel was elite really just at the very beginning, from like about 1893 to 1897. When the Waldorf got really big with the addition of the Astoria, a lot of the more upper crust types, you know, the Vanderbilts and so on, moved northward, especially when competitors like the St. Regis, the Plaza opened. So a lot of the carriage trade, they still came, but really it became a place, I would say, for the most part, of the middle class. Just to give you an idea, when the old Waldorf closed, the rooms were about $6 a night. So this is like 1929. And when the new Waldorf opened in 31, that was the lowest level of room. That's only about maybe $110 today. So it was pretty affordable. And what I found was that the Waldorf-Astoria really reflected the diversity of the city to a great extent. And in many ways, to answer that question, the book really does center on these social movements that really played out within the walls of the Waldorf-Astoria, in part, you know, from women's rights to labor struggles to prohibition, to segregation, and the Red Scare, anti-communism, and then the struggle for LGBT equality later on. So that's really the crux of the book, I would say. So does anyone else have any others? Okay.
No questions, anyone? Well, see, you were very thorough then.
Well, thank you everybody for joining and for sharing this evening with us.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Thank you, David. This was amazing. For everyone, this has been recorded, so it will be available on our YouTube channel. All of our programming is available on our YouTube channel. Please go check that out if you've missed anything or if you want to rewatch anything. We also have a virtual walking tours and in-person walking tours coming up. So please keep an eye on the HDC email and on our website, hdc.org. Thank you so much. Have a good night, everyone.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, everyone.